The henhouse door hung crooked on its hinges, swaying in the pre-dawn wind like a broken promise. Caleb Merrick stood in the doorway of his cabin, bare feet on cold wood, watching the shadow move inside the coop. Not a fox, not a coyote. The shape was too careful, too human in the way it crouched and hesitated between each step. He didn't reach for his rifle. He pulled on his boots, grabbed his coat, and walked out into the blue-gray light that comes just before the sun remembers its job. The air smelled like frost and dry grass. His breath hung in front of him, then disappeared. The figure inside the coop didn't hear him coming. Caleb stopped 3 feet from the door and waited. He could see her now through the slats, a girl, maybe 19 or 20, her hair tangled and dark, her dress torn at the shoulder and streaked with mud. She was holding an egg in both hands like it might shatter if she breathed too hard. She placed it gently into a cloth sack at her feet, then reached for another. Caleb counted 5 eggs before he spoke. "You planning to pay for those?" The girl froze, her shoulders locked, her head didn't turn. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, she stood and faced him. Her eyes were green and exhausted. There was a bruise along her jawline, faded yellow at the edges, and her lips were cracked from cold or thirst or both. She didn't look scared. She looked like someone who had stopped expecting mercy a long time ago. "I wasn't going to take them all," she said quietly. Her voice was steadier than he expected. Caleb looked at the sack. "That's so. Just enough to eat, maybe trade for bread in town." She shifted her weight, her hands still hovering near the eggs like she couldn't decide whether to run or fight. "I wasn't going to hurt the birds." "Didn't think you were." She blinked, surprised. Caleb glanced past her at the hens, who had already settled back into their nests, unbothered by the intrusion. He looked back at the girl. Her feet were bare, mud caked between her toes, dried and cracked. She had no coat, no blanket, nothing but the dress and the sack. "How long you been out here?" he asked. She didn't answer. "How long?" he repeated, softer this time. 2 days, maybe 3. Her jaw tightened. "I lose track." Caleb nodded slowly. He looked at her face again, really looked this time, and something in the back of his mind stirred, something familiar he couldn't place. The shape of her nose, the way she held her shoulders back even when she was caught red-handed. But he didn't say anything. "You got a name?" he asked. She hesitated, then Nora. "Nora what?" "Just Nora." He didn't push. He stepped aside and gestured toward the cabin. "Come on." She didn't move. "I'm not asking twice," he said. "You're cold, you're hungry, and you've been sleeping in the dirt. Come inside." "Why?" The question caught him off guard. "Why what?" "Why would you help me?" Her voice cracked just a little. "You don't know me. You caught me stealing from you. Why would you?" "Because I've got eggs I'm not using and a stove that works," Caleb said simply. "And because standing out here arguing about it is a waste of time for both of us." Nora stared at him, searching his face for something, a lie maybe or a trap. But Caleb just waited, hands in his coat pockets, his expression unreadable. Finally, she bent down, picked up the sack, and followed him. Inside, the cabin was small but clean. A single room with a wood stove in the corner, a table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bed pushed against the far wall. The walls were bare except for a single photograph nailed above the stove. A man and a woman standing in front of a fence, unsmiling, their faces worn but dignified. Nora stood just inside the door, clutching the sack to her chest. Caleb gestured to the table. "Sit." She didn't. He sighed, walked to the stove, and began building a fire. The kindling caught quickly, and within minutes, the room began to warm. He filled a kettle with water from a bucket near the door and set it on the stove to heat. "You eat meat?" he asked without turning around. "I eat anything that doesn't kill me," she said. Caleb almost smiled. He pulled a tin of salted pork from a shelf, sliced off a few pieces, and dropped them into a skillet. The smell filled the cabin immediately, rich and smoky and impossibly good. Nora's stomach growled, loud enough for him to hear. "Sit down," he said again, this time more gently. She did. He fried the pork, scrambled 4 eggs, and set the plate in front of her along with a tin cup of hot water. She stared at it like it might vanish if she looked away. "Go on," Caleb said. She ate. Not slowly, not politely. She ate like someone who hadn't seen food in days, her hands shaking as she scooped eggs into her mouth and chewed without tasting. Caleb didn't watch. He poured himself a cup of water and sat across from her, giving her space to breathe. When the plate was empty, she set down the fork and Dee looked at him. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded. "Now what?" she asked. "Now you tell me why you're out here alone with no shoes and a bruise on your face." Her expression hardened. "That's not your business." "Maybe not," Caleb said, "but if you're running from someone, I'd like to know before they show up at my door looking for you." Nora's hands tightened around the tin cup. She looked down at the table, her jaw working like she was chewing on words she didn't want to say. "I was sold," she said finally. Caleb went very still. "Sold," he repeated. 3 weeks ago, in a barn outside of Crosswood. Her voice was flat, like she was reciting a list of chores. "My uncle owed money to a man named Garrett Lowell. He couldn't pay, so he sold me instead." Caleb's chest tightened. "Lowell kept me locked in a room for 2 weeks. Tried to," she stopped, her throat working. "I got out, stole a horse, rode until it threw me, been walking since." "And your uncle?" "Dead to me," she said simply. Caleb didn't argue. He stood, walked to the stove, and poured her more water. When he set the cup in front of her, their eyes met, and for just a moment, something passed between them, recognition, maybe, or understanding, something deeper than words. But Nora looked away first. "What's your name?" she asked. "Caleb Merrick." Her head snapped up. "Merrick," she repeated, her voice suddenly sharp. Caleb frowned. "You know that name." She stared at him, her green eyes wide and glittering with something he couldn't name. Then she stood abruptly, knocking her chair backward. "I have to go." "Wait. I shouldn't have come here." "Nora." "Let me leave," she said, her voice rising. "Just let me go." Caleb stepped in front of the door. "Not until you tell me why you're looking at me like I'm the devil himself." Nora's breath came fast and shallow, her hands balled into fists at her sides. "Because your name," she whispered, "is the last thing my father said before they hanged him." The silence in the cabin was so thick it felt like drowning. Caleb didn't move, he didn't blink. He just stared at Nora, his mind racing backward through years of dust and blood and decisions he'd buried so deep he thought they'd never crawl back out. "Who was your father?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thomas Brennan." The name hit him like a fist to the chest. Thomas Brennan, the farmer who'd stood trial for treason after the war, the man accused of selling grain to Confederate holdouts in the hills, the man who'd sworn on his daughter's life that he was innocent, that he'd been framed by men who wanted his land. The man Caleb had been ordered to guard the night before the hanging. "No," Caleb said, shaking his head. "No, that's not." "You were there," Nora said, her voice trembling. "You stood outside his cell. He told me. He said there was a young soldier named Merrick who wouldn't look him in the eye." Caleb's throat closed. He remembered. He remembered standing in the dirt outside the makeshift jail, his rifle on his shoulder, his hands shaking because he was 19 years old and didn't know how to do anything but follow orders. He remembered Thomas Brennan calling out through the bars, asking if anyone would listen, begging someone to check the ledgers, to talk to the merchants, to prove he hadn't done what they said. And Caleb had stood there, silent, because he was a soldier, and soldiers didn't question the law. "I was just following orders," Nora finished bitterly. "I know, everyone was just following orders." She turned away, her shoulders shaking, and Caleb saw it then. the weight she'd been carrying, the rage and grief and exhaustion that had nothing to do with hunger or cold or bruises. They hanged him in front of the whole town, she said quietly, made me watch. I was 12 years old, and when it was over, a man named Garrett Lowell bought our land for a fraction of what it was worth, said it was legal, said my father's crime made us forfeit. Caleb's stomach turned. Lowell, he said. The same man my uncle sold me to, Nora said. He's been circling my family like a vulture since the day they put the noose around my father's neck. Caleb sat down heavily in the chair, his hands pressed flat against the table. His mind was spinning, trying to fit the pieces together, trying to make sense of something that had never made sense. I didn't know, he said hoarsely. I didn't know Lowell was involved. I didn't know your father was innocent. Does it matter? Nora turned to face him, her eyes red-rimmed. You didn't stop it. You didn't ask questions. You just stood there and let them kill him. I was 19, Caleb said, his voice breaking. I didn't know how to. You knew enough to hold a rifle. The words cut deeper than any knife. Caleb looked down at his hands. They were calloused and scarred, the hands of a man who'd spent years trying to forget what he'd done in the war, what he'd seen, what he'd failed to do. Oh, you're right, he said quietly. Nora blinked, surprised. You're right, Caleb repeated, looking up at her. I should have asked questions. I should have listened. I should have done something other than stand there like a coward and let an innocent man die. His voice was raw, stripped of anything but truth. I've thought about that night every day since, he said. I've thought about your father's voice, the way he kept saying, check the ledgers, just check the ledgers. And I didn't, I just stood there. Nora's breath hitched. Why are you telling me this? She whispered. Because you deserve to know, Caleb said, and because I can't undo what I didn't do, but I can do something now. Like what? Like making sure Lowell doesn't take anything else from you. Nora stared at him, her hands trembling at her sides. You don't owe me anything, she said. I owe your father everything, Caleb replied. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled in the stove, the wind rattled the shutters, and between them something shifted, something fragile and uncertain, but real. I don't forgive you, Nora said finally. I don't expect you to. But I'm not leaving yet. Caleb nodded slowly. Then stay, work with me, help me fix this place up. I'll pay you fair wages. You can save enough to leave, go wherever you want. Nora's eyes narrowed. Why would you do that? Because it's the right thing to do, Caleb said simply, and because I'm tired of carrying ghosts. She studied him, searching his face for lies, for traps, for anything that felt like the men who'd sold her or the soldiers who'd killed her father. But all she saw was exhaustion and regret and something that might have been hope. One condition, she said. Name it. If Lowell comes looking for me, you don't hand me over, you don't negotiate, you don't try to be reasonable. Caleb stood. He walked to the door, pulled a shotgun down from the rack above it, and set it on the table between them. If Lowell comes looking for you, he said quietly, he'll leave in a box. Nora's breath caught. And for the first time since she'd walked into his cabin, she believed him. Outside, the sun finally broke over the hills, casting long shadows across the valley. Somewhere in the distance, a horse whinnied, and in the town of Crosswood, 15 miles south, a man named Garrett Lowell was already saddling up. 3 days passed. Nora worked. She mended the henhouse door, patched the roof where the rain had rotted through the shingles, and helped Caleb haul water from the creek. She didn't talk much. Neither did he, but they moved around each other with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that silence wasn't always empty. At night, she slept on a bedroll near the stove. Caleb gave her blankets and never asked questions. She woke before dawn and worked until her hands bled, and Caleb wondered if she was trying to outrun something or prove something or just exhaust herself enough to sleep without dreams. He didn't ask. On the 4th morning, a rider appeared on the horizon. Caleb saw him first, a dark shape moving slow and deliberate across the ridge, backlit by the rising sun. He set down the axe he'd been using to split firewood and wiped his hands on his pants. "Nora," he called. She looked up from the garden plot where she'd been pulling weeds. "Get inside," he said quietly. Her face went pale. "Is it?" "I don't know, but get inside." She ran. Caleb walked to the edge of the property and waited, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip. The rider came closer, his horse moving at an easy trot, and as he crested the hill, Caleb's chest tightened. It wasn't Lowell. It was worse. Sheriff Clayton Voss dismounted 30 feet away and tied his horse to the fence post. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and thick-necked, with a badge pinned to his vest and a rifle slung across his back. His face was weathered and hard, the kind of face that had seen too much and stopped caring. "Merrick," Voss said, nodding. "Sheriff. Been a while. Not long enough." Voss smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He walked closer, his boots crunching on the gravel, and stopped a few feet from Caleb. "I'll get straight to it," he said. "I'm looking for a girl, about 20 years old, dark hair, green eyes, goes by the name Nora Brennan." Caleb's expression didn't change. "Don't know her." "That's so. That's so." Voss tilted his head, studying him. "Funny thing, Garrett Lowell says she stole a horse from him 3 weeks ago, says she's dangerous, says she might be headed this way." "Lowell's a liar," Caleb said flatly. "Maybe," Voss said, "but he's got the law on his side. The girl was sold to him legally. She's his property until her debt's paid. Slavery's been over for 11 years, Sheriff." "Debt ain't slavery, Merrick, you know that." Caleb's jaw tightened. "She's not here." Voss looked past him toward the cabin. The door was closed, the shutters drawn, smoke curled from the chimney. "You mind if I take a look?" Voss asked. "Yeah, I do." The sheriff's smile faded. "I can get a warrant." "Then get one." For a long moment, they stood facing each other, the tension thick enough to choke on. Voss's hand drifted toward his rifle, and Caleb's fingers twitched near his revolver. Then Voss laughed, a low, bitter sound. "You always were a stubborn son of a bitch," he said, "even back during the war, always asking questions, always making things harder than they had to be." "I learned my lesson about keeping quiet," Caleb said. Voss's eyes narrowed. "You talking about Thomas Brennan?" Caleb didn't answer. "That was a long time ago," Voss said. "Man was guilty, had a fair trial." "Trial was rigged," Caleb said, "and you know it." Voss took a step closer, his voice dropping to a growl. "Careful, Merrick, you keep talking like that, people might start thinking you're sympathetic to traitors." "People can think whatever they want. Not if it gets them hanged." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Caleb didn't flinch. He met Voss's gaze and held it, his expression cold and steady. "She's not here," he said again. "Now get off my land." Voss stared at him for a long moment. Then he smiled, slow and mean. "You're making a mistake," he said. "Lowell's not a man you want to cross. He's got friends, he's got money, and he doesn't forget." "Neither do I," Caleb said. Voss shook his head, walked back to his horse, and swung into the saddle. He looked down at Caleb, his eyes hard. "I'll be back," he said, "with a warrant, and when I find her, you'll hang right alongside her for harboring a fugitive." He turned the horse and rode off, dust rising in his wake. Caleb watched until he disappeared over the ridge. Then he turned and walked back to the cabin. Inside, Nora was standing by the window, her face pressed against the glass, her hands shaking. "He's going to come back," she whispered. "I know. With more men. I know." She turned to face him, her eyes wide and terrified. "You should turn me in. You should save yourself." Caleb crossed the room and stood in front of her. He didn't touch her. He just looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the same fear he'd seen in her father's eyes the night before the hanging. "I didn't save your father," he said quietly, but I'll die before I let them take you. Nora's breath hitched. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she pressed her hands over her mouth to stop the sob that wanted to break free. Why? She whispered. Because some things are worth standing for, Caleb said. Outside, the wind picked up, the sky darkened, and somewhere in the distance, hoofbeats echoed across the valley. The storm came that night. Rain lashed against the cabin walls, drumming on the roof like 1,000 fingers tapping for entry. Lightning split the sky in jagged white lines, and thunder rolled across the valley so loud it shook the windows. Caleb sat at the table, cleaning his shotgun by lamplight. Nora sat across from him, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of tea, her eyes distant. You don't have to do this, she said quietly. Caleb didn't look up. We've been over this. I know, but I'm saying it again. She set the cup down, her fingers trembling. You don't owe me anything. You don't owe my father anything. You were just a soldier. You were following orders. And your father was just a farmer, Caleb said, finally meeting her eyes. And he died anyway. Nora looked away. Caleb set down the cleaning rag and leaned back in his chair. I've spent the last 11 years trying to forget that night, trying to convince myself it wasn't my fault, that I was just doing my job. He paused, his jaw tightening. But the truth is, I knew something was wrong. I knew your father didn't sound like a liar. I knew the trial felt rushed, and I didn't do a damn thing about it. You were young, Nora said. So were you, Caleb replied. And you still remember every word he said before they killed him, don't you? She flinched. Caleb stood, walked to the stove, and poured himself a cup of water. The rain hammered harder, and the lamplight flickered. I'm not doing this to make myself feel better, he said quietly. I'm doing it because it's the only thing I can do. And if I don't, I'll spend the rest of my life standing outside another cell, watching another innocent person die. Nora's throat worked. She looked down at her hands, scarred and calloused from days of hard work. He used to tell me stories, she said softly. At night, before bed, stories about brave knights and dragons and princesses who saved themselves. Caleb sat back down, listening. He said the world was full of people who looked the other way, Nora continued. But that didn't mean we had to be one of them. He said even when you're scared, even when it costs you everything, you stand up, because that's what makes you human. Her voice broke. And then they hanged him for standing up. Caleb reached Acro, assessed the table, and placed his hand over hers. She didn't pull away. Your father was right, he said quietly, and I'm sorry it took me this long to learn it. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the storm raging outside, the lamplight casting long shadows on the walls. Nora's hand was cold beneath his, but slowly she turned her palm up and laced her fingers through his. If we die tomorrow, she said, I want you to know I don't hate you. You should, Caleb said. Maybe, she said, but I don't. He squeezed her hand gently. Outside, the lightning flashed again, illuminating the valley in stark white. And in that brief moment of light, Caleb saw riders, dozens of them, moving through the rain toward the cabin. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. What is it? Nora asked, her voice sharp. They're here. So here's the question that changes everything. If you were in Caleb's boots, knowing you failed once before, would you stand your ground, even if it meant losing everything? Would you fight for someone else's redemption when you haven't found your own? Take a breath, think about it. And if you're still with me, tell me in the comments what time it is where you are right now. I want to know who's riding this story out with me. Caleb grabbed the shotgun and moved to the window. Nora was beside him instantly, her face pale but determined. How many? She whispered. Too many. Through the rain, Caleb could make out shapes, 10, maybe 12 riders, moving slow and deliberate. At the front was Sheriff Voss, and beside him, a man in a long black coat. Even in the dark, Caleb recognized him. Garrett Lowell. They're not here to talk, Caleb said. Nora's breath quickened. What do we do? Caleb looked at her, this girl who'd lost everything, who'd been sold and beaten and hunted, who still somehow had the strength to stand beside him. We don't give up, he said. He handed her a revolver from the drawer. She took it without hesitation. You know how to use that? He asked. My father taught me. Caleb nodded. Then we make him proud. The riders stopped 50 feet from the cabin. Voss dismounted, followed by Lowell and 6 armed men. The rest stayed on their horses, rifles drawn. Merrick, Voss shouted over the rain. Send the girl out and we'll leave you alone. Caleb opened the door and stepped onto the porch, shotgun in hand. Rain soaked through his shirt instantly, but he didn't move. She's not going anywhere, he shouted back. Lowell stepped forward, his face twisted with rage. She's mine, I paid for her, you're harboring stolen property. She's a person, Caleb roared, not property, not anymore. The law says different, Voss shouted. Then the laws rung. For a moment, no one moved. The rain poured down, and the thunder rumbled, and the two sides faced each other across the muddy yard. Then, from behind the riders, a voice called out. Voss! Everyone turned. A group of men emerged from the darkness, ranch hands, farmers, men Caleb had worked beside for years. Old Charlie Hayes, who ran the feed store, Sam Bridger, who'd fought in the same regiment as Caleb during the war. A dozen others, all armed, all standing in the rain. What the hell is this? Voss demanded. This, Charlie said, his voice steady, is us deciding we're not letting you take that girl. Lowell's face went red. You have no authority. Don't need authority, Sam interrupted, just need a conscience. The ranch hands spread out, forming a line between the riders and the cabin. They didn't raise their weapons. They just stood there, soaked and silent and unmovable. Voss looked at them, then at Caleb, then back at Lowell. You want to start a war over one girl? Voss asked quietly. She's mine, Lowell hissed. Then come take her, Caleb said. No one moved. The rain fell. And slowly, one by one, Lowell's hired guns lowered their rifles. This isn't over, Lowell spat. Yes, Caleb said, it is. Voss stared at him for a long moment. Then he turned, mounted his horse, and rode off into the storm. Lowell followed, cursing under his breath, and the rest of the riders scattered. The ranch hands stayed until the last rider disappeared. Then Charlie Hayes walked up to the porch and tipped his hat. Heard you might need a hand, he said. Caleb smiled, small and tired and genuine. Appreciate it, Charlie. She's safe now. She is. Charlie nodded. Good, then we'll see you Sunday at church. He turned and walked back into the rain, and the others followed. Caleb stood on the porch, watching them go. Then he felt a hand slip into his. Nora stood beside him, tears streaming down her face. Thank you, she whispered. Caleb squeezed her hand. Thank your father, he taught you to keep standing. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and for the first time in 11 years, Caleb felt the weight of ghosts begin to lift. Spring came slow to the valley. The rain gave way to sun, and the grass turned green again, and the high LLS bloomed with wildflowers the color of bruises and hope. Nora stayed. She didn't ask permission. She just stayed, and Caleb didn't question it. They worked the land together, planting, mending, building. She learned how to shoe a horse, how to fix a fence, how to read the sky for storms. He learned how to listen, how to let silence sit without filling it, how to carry the past without letting it crush him. They didn't talk about Lowell or Voss or the night the riders came. There was no need. The threat had passed, scattered by the quiet courage of men who decided that some things were worth standing for. But the weight of what had been lost, what could never be undone, still lingered. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the valley in gold and amber, Nora found Caleb standing near the fence line, staring at the horizon. What are you thinking about? She asked. He didn't answer right away. Then quietly, your father. She stood beside him, her shoulder brushing his. I keep thinking, Caleb said, that if I just asked one question that night, if I just knocked on the door and said, show me the ledgers, everything would have been different. You'd still have your father, you'd still have your land, you wouldn't have. Stop, Nora said gently. He looked at her. You can't live in the what-ifs, she said. I tried. For years I tried, and all it did was make me angry and tired and hollow. She reached up and placed her hand on his cheek, her touch light but steady. You didn't save my father, she said, but you saved me, and that matters. Caleb's throat tightened. Does it? Yes, she said, because I was drowning, and you pulled me out, and you didn't ask for forgiveness or try to make yourself the hero. You just stood there, even when it cost you. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. So stop punishing yourself, she whispered. My father wouldn't want that, and neither do I. For a long moment, Caleb just looked at her, this woman who had every reason to hate him, who had been sold and hunted and broken, but who still somehow found the strength to forgive. I don't deserve you, he said hoarsely. No, she said, smiling through her tears, but you're stuck with me anyway. He pulled her into his arms, and she buried her face in his chest, and they stood there as the sun set and the stars began to rise. A month later, Caleb rode into Crosswood with Nora at his side. It was market day, and the town square was crowded with farmers and merchants and families. People stared as they passed, some curious, some disapproving, some quietly respectful. Caleb didn't care. He stopped in front of the sheriff's office and dismounted. Nora stayed on her horse, her jaw set, her hands steady on the reins. Sheriff Voss stepped out onto the porch, his expression wary. Merrick, he said, what do you want? Caleb pulled a stack of papers from his saddlebag and handed them to Voss. These are the ledgers from Thomas Brennan's farm, Caleb said, the ones that prove he didn't sell grain to Confederates, the ones that prove Garrett Lowell lied. Voss's face went pale. Where did you? Doesn't matter where I got them, Caleb said. What matters is that they're real, and they prove Thomas Brennan was innocent. Voss looked down at the papers, then back at Caleb. Even if this is true, it's been 11 years. The man's dead. There's nothing. There's his name, Caleb interrupted, and his daughter's future. Clear his name, Voss, publicly, or I'll take these papers to every newspaper between here and Denver. Voss's jaw tightened. He glanced at Nora, who stared back at him with eyes like green fire. You think this changes anything? Voss asked quietly. I think, Caleb said, that you have a choice. You can do the right thing now, or you can spend the rest of your life knowing you didn't. For a long moment, the sheriff said nothing. Then he took the papers, folded them carefully, and tucked them under his arm. I'll look into it, he said. You do that, Caleb said. He turned, climbed back onto his horse, and rode out of town with Nora beside him. Behind them, whispers spread through the crowd, and by the time they reached the edge of town, people were talking, not about the girl who'd been sold, but about the farmer who'd been hanged for a crime he didn't commit. And slowly, like a stone rolling downhill, the truth began to move. 2 months later, a notice appeared in the Crosswood Gazette. Thomas Brennan exonerated, evidence proves innocence, land rights to be restored to surviving family. Nora read it 3 times before she let herself believe it. Caleb stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The words on the page spoke for themselves. That evening, they rode out to the place where her father's farm had stood. The house was gone, burned years ago, but the fence posts still remained, and the apple tree her father had planted still bore fruit. Nora dismounted and walked to the tree. She placed her hand on the trunk, feeling the rough bark beneath her palm, and closed her eyes. I did it, Papa, she whispered. I stood up. Caleb stayed back, giving her space, watching as she cried and smiled and finally let go. When she returned to him, her face was streaked with tears, but her eyes were clear. Thank you, she said. You did this, Caleb said, not me. We did it, she corrected, together. He smiled, slow and genuine, and full of something that might have been hope. So what now? He asked. Nora looked back at the tree, then at the valley beyond, then at Caleb. Now, she said, we build something new. They built a house on the land where her father's farm had stood. It was small at first, just 2 rooms and a porch, but it was theirs. They planted crops, raised chickens, and slowly, carefully, built a life from the ashes of what had been lost. People came to help, Charlie Hayes, Sam Bridger, and others who'd stood in the rain that night. They brought lumber and nails and stories, and together they raised walls and laid floors and hammered shingles onto the roof. Nora worked beside them, her hands calloused and strong, her laughter ringing out across the valley. And Caleb watched her, marveling at the way she'd transformed from a girl caught stealing eggs into a woman who'd reclaimed her name, her land, and her future. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set, Nora leaned her head on Caleb's shoulder. Do you ever regret it? She asked. Regret what? Not turning me in, standing up to Voss and Lowell, all of it. Caleb was quiet for a moment, then he said, no. Not even a little. Not even a little. She smiled, good. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars appeared one by one, scattered across the sky like seeds waiting to grow. Caleb, Nora said softly. Yes. Thank you for giving me a choice. He turned to look at her, confused. A choice. You said work with me or stay beside me forever, she reminded him. You gave me the choice, and I chose to stay. Caleb's chest tightened. He reached for her hand and held it gently. I'm glad you did, he said. Me too. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of wildflowers and fresh earth. In the distance, a coyote called, and on the porch of a house built on forgiveness and second chances, 2 people who'd once been haunted by ghosts finally found peace. Years later, travelers passing through the valley would sometimes stop at the Merrick farm and ask about the 2 wooden crosses near the fence line. That's for Thomas Brennan and his wife, Eliza, Nora would say. They owned this land before me. Family, the travelers would ask. Yes, she'd say, smiling, family. And she'd return to her work, planting seeds in soil her father had once tilled, building a future he'd never see but would have been proud of. And beside her always was Caleb Merrick, the man who'd learned too late how to ask questions, but just in time to find his answer. The sun dipped lower, dust rose around their feet. And the valley, at last, was quiet.